Good morning. Welcome to the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy's live weekly broadcast. I'm Roberta Oster, the Communications Director. Our show, Virginia Interfaith Live, brings you the latest news and resources from policy and faith experts, legislators, and community leaders. And you are part of the broadcast. You can ask questions during the show. Just write them in on your Facebook Live. Please take time to think about what you care about and use this as an opportunity to ask questions. And during these difficult times dealing with COVID-19, our program focuses on economic, racial, social, and environmental justice issues here in Virginia. We will keep you up to date, and we will keep our elected officials accountable. We'll also share opportunities for you to get involved in our work advancing social justice and helping our neighbors. Today, we will be addressing a critical issue, legislative battles to reduce energy bills, with Delegate Jay Jones. I am pleased to introduce our moderator and my wonderful colleague, Kendyl Crawford, who is the Director of Virginia Interfaith Power and Light. Kendyl?
Hi. Thanks so much for tuning in today. Again, as was said, my name is Kendyl Crawford. I'm Director of Virginia Interfaith Power and Light, and I am so very excited to chat with our guest who is joining me today, Delegate Jay Jones. Delegate Jones represents the 89th District in the Virginia House of Delegates. He serves on the Appropriations Committee, Transportation Committee, as well as counties, cities, and towns. He's a lifelong resident of Norfolk, which I was very excited to learn about because I also am from the 757, right across the bridge from Hampton. Delegate Jones is Catholic. He's a member of the Basilica of St. Mary of the Immaculate Conception. And that reminds me that as we're gearing up to the 5th anniversary of Pope Francis's encyclical, Laudato Si, on the care of our common home, this is a perfect time to have this conversation about the intersections between poverty, the environment, and energy. Jay, do you happen to have any fun facts that you'd like to share with our viewers today?
Fun facts about yourself or fun facts generally? I can do either.
Fun facts about yourself.
Yeah, again, like you said, I'm from Norfolk, 3rd generation, or I guess 4th generation Norfolkian now, getting married this year, which is very exciting, but really focused in on, trying to continue our legislative work out of session, even amidst the challenges of COVID. But, I'm just happy to be here, happy to be able to chat with you guys this morning to talk about an issue that's really important to me and something that I think really should be important to all Virginians is their electricity bills, their energy burden, and our way forward.
Cool. Before we get started, I have a silly quick question for you.
Sure.
So is it Norfolk? Norfolk? I'm not quite sure. I'm right from across the water, across the bridge. But I feel like I've always been saying it wrong.
Yeah, I think I don't know if there's a right answer to your question. I say Norfolk. It's kind of just straight through. Some people do say Norfolk, and other people really do pronounce it phonetically and say Norfolk. I would just say Norfolk, to keep it quick and short and dirty. But it's up to you. You pick your person. I think anything is particularly wrong per se. We're just very proud that people know Norfolk and know that, the wonderful things that we bring to the table. We are on the water, which I think is beautiful and great. And so, I love the Mermaid City. I've lived here my whole life, except for college and law school, basically, and was excited to come back. And now I make my home here, and it's great. And I think that every day I discover something new about the city that I did not know before. And I think people who live here will tell you, once you get here, it's very difficult to leave because the quality of life is so high.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you for educating me on that today. So digging right in, you mentioned the term energy burden. Could you tell us a little bit more about what is it? The term itself sounds kind of wonky.
Yeah, I think, and let me start by saying, I think this entire subject has this sort of perception of being wonky, but it's not. And I think people are dissuaded from talking about it and getting into it because of these big words and these terms that might sound confusing and complex. But when we talk about energy burden, we're talking about what people are paying and what people have on a monthly basis. They're being charged, whether it's by Dominion or Appalachian or whoever their power provider is. And it's something that, as I have gotten into this and really sort of dug my teeth into it, that there is a disproportionate share of people who are paying more for their energy, right? So it is becoming a burden on them in their pocketbooks. And so as we sort of look at this in the legislature, I think there are many of us who are really committed to reducing the energy burden on working people across Virginia, because they shouldn't have to pay a disproportionate share. And there's so many things that sort of go into that sort of equation. But I think the simplest and cleanest way to think about it is, okay, we get our energy bills every month, right? You pay it because you have to. You have no choice, because without your electricity, you can't have your internet, you can't have TV, you can't feed yourself. There are so many things that are sort of dependent on that. And at a certain point, somewhere along the way, differing minds can tell you when the burden has become so crushing on working families across Virginia that they're often faced with a choice, right? Do you pay your electric bill or do you pay your rent? Or do you feed your family or go to the grocery store, or do you pay your electric bill, right? It's a sort of a chicken and the egg scenario. And I get a little bit frustrated because when you look at countries across this globe, the energy burdens are very different, and how families are being charged for what they use, but also the products that they don't use that they're still getting charged for. And so I think that has become a concern of mine and many of my colleagues in the General Assembly as we seek to sort of rein that in and make sure that people's energy burdens aren't disproportionate and they aren't so crushing that they can't make a life for themselves.
So you just talked a little bit about just some comparisons. So what does Virginia look like, just compared to some other places, like whether other states or other countries? Is it particularly bad here? Are we doing good?
I think if we were doing well, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. But I think by all accounts, you can say that Virginia's energy burden and our bills are among the highest in the country. I think last time I checked, it was probably 7th or 8th highest in the nation, which to me doesn't really make much sense. And you wonder why, right? And so it forces you to ask this question and to dig into what is driving. And I think part of what comes to mind is that our system is a little bit funky. We're working under what I believe to be an outdated energy regulation system. I think we are sort of lagging in how we approach and differentiate what is going into the bill and how that's calculated. And you'll hear me talk about the SCC and the State Corporation Commission a couple of times today, and they're really the governing body that sort of oversees how Dominion and the other utilities are allowed to operate. But what is very important to note and key to this whole thing is that the SCC basically administers the rules that we in the legislature set for them. And so that I think has become a very important crux of how we sort of approach this conversation, is how does the legislature actually administer and set the rules and regulations for the terms for our electric utilities here in Virginia.
Mm-hmm. So I know you just mentioned some of the impacts of energy burden with families having to choose between groceries and keeping the lights on. Could you let us know a little bit about how the issue is impacting your district, and also how you're getting this information out to different communities, especially the Latinx community?
Sure, and that's an interesting question, and I will tell you, and we spoke about this a little bit beforehand. My journey to getting to this point, and I think that's instructive because I believe. For the longest time, when folks talk about energy and they talk about the environment, they don't believe that it's an issue that affects communities of color. By way of background, my district is a majority minority district. It's about 55% Black, and so people seem to be a little bit confused when they see me talking about these issues pretty frequently. But climate change and energy are issues that impact everybody, and it certainly has disproportionately affected communities of color because obviously there's some challenges in income levels and wages that really skews this burden sort of towards them. And so I say all that to say, we need to do as best a job as we can to sort of educate our communities, because once they realize that it's an issue, people say, yeah, that's a no-brainer. But I think part of what it is that we've become so used to just paying the electric bill, right? You see it come in and it says that, I owe $90 a month, or I owe $120 a month, or $180 a month, and you just pay it. And you don't think about what's feeding into that. You don't look at the line by line breakdown, which they're required to give you on the bill, to say, well, why is that, so high, or why am I paying for this when I don't use that? And so, I've asked the questions and I've continued to ask the questions, but I'm very fortunate to be joined in the House of Delegates by plenty of folks who represent communities that are Black and brown and all the rest of the minority communities. And we've really tried to explain and to bring attention to it and to make it a priority for folks because it is important, right? It's important for your day-to-day lives, and it's never more important than right now. When you have folks who are struggling all across Virginia, who have lost their jobs or have been furloughed or have been temporarily put out of work, and you still got to pay your electric bills. And so we've run into some issues across the state. I think that our utilities have attempted, at least in a halfway, to try to be a little bit more understanding at this point for people who have been affected by the pandemic. The governor has obviously issued his order, and the attorney general has gotten involved as well. And so we're sort of putting people in a position where they don't have to make that choice right now. But what worries me and what I've sort of been working on behind the scenes is to figure out how we make that bridge more permanent going forward. But certainly, I think, and over the last couple of years, we had a very big shift in the legislature in 2017 and 2019. So you've gotten plenty of folks who think in the same way that we do and who prioritize this as an issue. And so, we take it back to our communities, and we take it back to our districts, and we take it to our faith leaders. We take it to our community leaders who can be wonderful allies and voices in this fight too.
So do you think that the issue of energy burden is really starting to be seen as the justice issue that it is?
I'd like to think so. We hear a lot about environmental justice, but I'd like to think that energy justice is something that goes hand in hand, with that. And I think if you looked at the data, the number of shutoffs, the number of folks who are behind on their bills are disproportionately people of color. I represent every low-income housing community in the city of Norfolk, and I can tell you that I get plenty of calls from them asking me to help them liaise with Dominion, who is our service provider, to figure out their way forward, whether it's getting on a payment plan or whether it is sort of getting them to a place where they're have energy efficiency in their units so that their bill doesn't become so high because the AC is not running all the time because the heat's getting in. There's so many things that we can do. But my hope is that people are really sort of listening and understanding. And again, I think going back to your initial question, it is a difficult thing to sort of wrap your head around if you're unfamiliar with the subject matter. And until people realize that, we are in effect sanctioning, what I would call corporate rating, right, of our pockets, that's got to change. And that's, it doesn't sit well with me. And again, admittedly, when I got to the General Assembly 3 years ago, this was not an issue that was immediately in my sort of, forefront. And so I wanted to sort of think about it in a way where how do I, break this down and drill down on this so that everybody can sort of figure this out and understand it. And again, it's not easy. It's not something that you can pick up, like this. You've got to really sort of dig into it, but try to figure out ways to sort of translate this to the average person who might not, otherwise think about this because they've got other things that are priorities to them, like their children, putting food on the table at night, making sure they can get to and from work on time, right? Those are obviously other priorities, but this, to me, is an issue that can unlock financial, security and help people, in a way that they just have never thought about before.
Mm-hmm. Well, I see a question from one of our viewers, Ann Murphy, and it looks like she is asking about Dominion's status as a monopoly. Mm-hmm. And she wants to know a little bit of the history. How did we get to this point where, although we do have a regulated monopoly, it's not actually acting in the best interests of, Virginia bill payers?
Well, and that is a tremendous question. And this story goes back decades when it was Virginia Electric Power Company, VEPCO, before it became Dominion. But the crux of the matter is that the General Assembly, right, the House and the Senate, set and promulgate rules for the State Corporation Commission, which was supposed to be the administrative body that sort of oversaw the utility companies, right? So we've got Appalachian Power, we've got Dominion, that are the biggest ones in Virginia. And for many, many years, and I think what is troubling to a lot of us is that Dominion is able to and has effectively lobbied the General Assembly to get these very favorable terms to basically tie the SEC's hands when they are going through rate cases, when they are assessing these one-off hearings to see if these projects can go forward. But effectively what you get is you've got a system in which the utility company goes to the SEC and says, well, we'd like to do this. And the SEC's hands are tied, and oftentimes from an oversight perspective, because the utility company has effectively lobbied the General Assembly to prevent the SEC from exercising its proper authority. And therefore, you have a sort of rigged game, if you will, that sort of promotes and allows the utility to basically do whatever they want and pass through the cost to the customer. And so when we talk about your energy bills, there are several components that go into that. Your bill isn't just one number, it's several different charges that come into it, and we end up often paying for a lot of things that we probably didn't necessarily need, or the cost should have been borne by the utility and not the consumer. And so that's why I've introduced a bill that had a lot of support this year in the House and from outside groups that unfortunately met its demise in the Senate, called the Fair Energy Bills Act, which would have basically restored the SEC's original oversight power to, for this rate case that was coming up in 2021, to basically say, look, here's a fair shake, here's a clean look at what consumers should be paying. And we estimate that bill might have gone down by anywhere from $10 to $20 for the average consumer, which is money. I think that there are plenty of folks in Virginia who don't think about 10 or 20 extra bucks in their pocket on a monthly basis, but there are plenty of people, plenty of working families who would kill for that extra money in their pockets. And so, and to sort of really drill down on your question, it is a regulated monopoly, and for a long time, the General Assembly has gone along with it. I think in the last couple of years in the House, we've really sort of rebuked that, and we were trying to pass legislation that's going to restore proper oversight to the SEC over the regulated utilities. There's been some hiccups in the Senate. I think that, and I'd like to be hopeful that the folks over there are getting more sort of smart about the issues and getting sort of to a viewpoint that we agree on as it relates to oversight. But, slaying the beast doesn't happen in a day. It's a longer process than I would think a lot of us would like to see, but we're working diligently and we're trying to find some ways to be creative to help working people.
You mentioned rate cases. Could you just speak a little bit more about what those are and what type of opportunity that would give families across Virginia?
Sure. Usually it's every 3 years, we have a triennial review in Virginia. The regulated utilities have to go to the SEC for basically a review, right? An audit based on a trailing number and looking forward. And the SEC is supposed to set the base rate for what the utility can charge consumers. And so that sounds really simple, but what you've seen in the past is that as we get to a rate case or up to a rate case, the utility companies are often very skilled and deft at lobbying the General Assembly to tie the hands a little bit of the SEC for that upcoming rate case. So the SEC says, okay, well, we'd have to look at it the way that the legislature says, and we would like to see this be the outcome. However, we can't because we're not allowed to take into account X, Y, or Z. So the legislative process is really important in the rate cases. We've gotten one in 2021. I was hopeful that my legislation would get through this year because it would have been effective for the 2021 rate case and would have allowed for the first clean review of earnings by the regulated utility since 1992, right? I was 3 years old the last time we had a clean rate case. Since then, we've had several reviews. They've just sort of had sort of bells and whistles on them that really prevent the SEC from doing its job. The legislature appoints the SEC representatives. Some people call them judges. They're really just experts who have a really deep understanding of the energy utility marketplace and the landscape. And so we would love to see them be able to do their jobs. And unfortunately, we sort of tie one hand behind their back as that happens. And so, there's probably one last bite at the apple next year, but it's going to take a legislative miracle. Unfortunately, I do believe that the bill that I introduced this year, House Bill 1132, the Fair Energy Bills Act, was probably one of our last best shots at that for 2021. The next case is in 2024. And so it's really incumbent upon us to make sure that as we go forward, we're trying to put a fair system in place for our consumers.
Cool. So I wanted to, I guess, kind of just return to one of the things that you mentioned earlier in our conversation. Just thinking about the impacts of the pandemic that we're, currently all facing.
Mm-hmm.
So in preparation for this chat, I just went to look back at my energy bills from last year. Normally, I work in an office, and I've just found that, like, comparing last year's bills for the past couple of months to this year's bills, my bill has already been about $27 higher, just because I've just been home all the time. So as you were saying, this is just an especially hard time for folks who are financially struggling, and they also have to pay bills that seem like they're higher than really necessary. So I wanted to highlight your recent op-ed that was featured in Roanoke Times. And I was just hoping you could share some of your ideas there, because there were a couple really exciting ones, especially, just kind of making sure that we realize that, for a modern society, just having access to power should be just a civil right for everyone. And trying to just stop customers from losing their power, indefinitely into the future, beyond the pandemic. So I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about the op-ed that you got placed.
Sure, and thank you for bringing that up. The opinion, op-ed piece in the Roanoke Times was really a two-pronged piece. The first was sort of touting our opportunity here as it relates to economic recovery and green energy and renewable energy as being a driving force in that recovery, which I firmly believe is a real piece and a key there for us to sort of reinvent our economy. This pandemic has really forced everybody to sort of reassess what we have been doing from an economic standpoint and where we're going. And I think that we've got some real strong opportunities that come out of the Virginia Clean Economy Act. Certainly I voted for it, worked very hard to get it to a place where I was comfortable to support it. We wanted to make sure that there were adequate ratepayer protections in that bill so that we did not end up getting sort of hung out to dry on costs that were not really attributed to us, but for the people who were building and executing the project. But really, this is a time in my mind when Dominion and the other regulated utilities can really step up and be that socially responsible corporate citizen that we want them to be, right? This is their opportunity to show and demonstrate to the consumers and their customers that they are a willing and able partner and want to come to the table. But I'll highlight a couple of things that I suggested in that piece that I think are really common sense measures during a time like this, during this pandemic, which we've never seen before, right? There are plenty of people who have filed for unemployment. I just saw this morning that jobless claims have reached over 35 million since the beginning of this COVID pandemic in the United States. Plenty of those, millions of those have been in Virginia alone. And those folks who don't have any money, right, shouldn't have to sort of make that choice between paying your rent and paying your utilities. And I would love to see Dominion sort of suspend bills for those people who are on unemployment. I think that's a really simple solution to give people a break and give people a bridge during these challenging times. We also know that Dominion is a massive corporation and has its obligations to its shareholders, and they are scheduled to give a dividend out at the end of June, which last I checked could be upwards of $700 million. I would love to see Dominion reinvest that money into the pockets of their consumers and say, hey, we'd like to give you a refund. We'd like to give you a break. We can deploy that money in a different way. And I say that to say right now, Dominion has done some decent things in the community, of course, over the course of many years, and we're very grateful for that. But now is really an opportunity to demonstrate that you're about the people and not about your shareholders. But understand that their obligation will always be to their shareholders as long as they're a sort of public company in that way, right? Most people would think a public company means that they're owned by the state. But in this case, you can go out and buy Dominion stock, and you can get your dividends on that every quarter as any other company on the stock market. And so when they are operating in the system that we set, they are operating from a position of maximizing value to their shareholders. And most of us are out there are not Dominion shareholders and don't have the benefit of having the ability to invest in a company to reap the benefits from it. But really, their benefit is providing electricity and energy to the consumer. And so I think that's where there's a disconnect in a lot of people's minds.
Now, thinking about, I suppose our Commonwealth's relationship with our utility companies, and also thinking about just the action that's required to address climate change. I suppose I'm just wondering about kind of the intersection between, energy burden, renewable energy, and then transferring away from fossil fuels. I know that I saw there's one. I saw a couple of questions from our viewers. I'm just wondering about the links between fossil fuels and moving to renewable energy. Also about the new header improvement project.
Mm-hmm. So they're all tied together in a way that I guess it's hard to unpack, but not impossible. We really want to make sure that we're transitioning to renewable energy in a responsible way. The Clean Economy Act, I think, was a great first step in that direction. Again, was it perfect? No, right? But will we go back each and every year to try to make sure that it's going to be as efficient and sort of productive as possible? Yes. There was a group of us who were very committed and very concerned about the ratepayer protections that were in the Clean Economy Act, right? To invest in renewable sources of energy costs a little bit of money, but to execute those projects, right, should not be should not sort of present a situation in which those costs get passed through to the consumer in an irresponsible way. We wanted to restore the SEC's power to really sort of be the watchdog for situations like those. So we can do it. I think that there are plenty of stories out there, plenty of articles out there that sort of try to obfuscate and create these red herrings about renewable energy being too expensive. We've seen projects on a small scale here in Virginia, whether it's solar, and we've seen projects across the country where we can say, look, this has happened and we can execute it and we can be a leader. And I've always said that, our economic future is really tied to renewable energy and clean and green energy technology. And why shouldn't Virginia be a hub? And being a homer, as I am from Hampton Roads, right, we should be the sort of ground zero for all of that, because we are threatened by climate change, but we also have the resources. We're going to do the offshore wind here piece off of Virginia Beach to do it, right? And that can help reinvent our economy and bring us away from the traditional things that we've relied on, at least down in Hampton Roads, which is tourism and our armed services, and to diversify our economy, but to create new jobs, and especially in a time when we're craving and needing new opportunities for folks. So it's a really wonderful opportunity, but we also want to make sure that as we are sort of going through this over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, that we're doing it responsibly, and that we are getting all the facts out there and getting all the information, and not letting some of these sort of red herrings sort of distract us a little bit and keep us from our eyes staying on the prize.
Cool. Well, we're almost at the end of our conversation today. And so for, I guess, a final question, what can Virginians do to show their support for fair energy bills? And why do you think that this should matter to people of faith?
Well, the first thing you guys can do if you want to show your support for fair energy bills is call your legislators. This actually passed the House of Delegates with almost 70 votes back in February, which was incredibly overwhelming and incredibly sort of heartwarming for me, because we put so much effort into this over the course of a year. Unfortunately, didn't get out of committee in the Senate. So my one piece of advice for everybody would be to call your senators, especially the folks who are on the Commerce and Labor Committee, which is where that bill unfortunately met its demise. So that's the big thing. Call your senators, talk to your legislators, make sure that they know that this is a priority for you going into the 2021 legislative session. But also, this is important to people of faith because, again, I'm Catholic. You mentioned that sort of towards the beginning. And obviously, we talk a lot about and hear a lot about compassion, and you hear a lot about caring for your brothers and sisters, no matter who they are, right? And this is really a time for us to realize that the people who are struggling, right, really can benefit from a policy like this. And if you have love and compassion for your brothers and sisters, right, there is that old maxim, I am my brother's keeper, I am my sister's keeper. There is no better way to demonstrate this than a measure like fair energy bills. Again, 10 or 20 bucks a month might not seem like a lot to some people, but for many, many people across the state, especially communities of color, that's a big deal, right? That extra $120 or $240 can go a long way towards more food, towards paying the rent, these necessities that we come across in our day-to-day lives. And so, the faith community was incredibly supportive of the Fair Energy Bills Act. I'm sure that any measure that comes back in the future that sort of gets at that same idea will garner the same support. It's just changing a couple more hearts and minds on the Senate side, and I think we have a real opportunity to do that. The rate case in 2021, it starts in, I think, March. And so if we were ever to do anything for 2021, we'd have to have an emergency clause on any legislation, and that requires 4/5. So understand that it's going to be a challenge. It's not impossible, of course, but certainly whether it's 2021 or 2024, there is a chance and there's a possibility, but it takes having these open and honest conversations and making sure that the people who are sitting in those chairs, who are making those decisions, the men and women from across Virginia, know that it's a priority for us.
Well, thank you so much, Jay. And one quick opportunity that I would like to highlight before we end our broadcast today is that Virginia Interfaith Power and Light currently is working on a People of Faith declaration on energy burden. And so we're trying to spread the awareness of the issue of energy burden and how it impacts poor folks and people of color all across Virginia. So if you would like to take action today, I encourage you to, the bit.ly link is right below, to go ahead and type that into your computer and to join the declaration on energy burden. And with that being said, any other last final thoughts, Jay?
Well, Kendyl, I just want to thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to join you guys. I think this was a great conversation. I hope it's not the last, certainly, hopefully many more after this to come. But I appreciate all that the Interfaith Center does across the Commonwealth to bring awareness to issues that are facing people who are facing challenges. And the work that you guys do is certainly admirable and worth praise. And you guys always have, my ears when you need somebody to listen, and my colleagues as well. And so I hope that everybody can stay safe, be well, and that we will see each other very soon when all of this sort of gets back to a place of normalcy.
Well, thank you so much, Jay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. We'll talk to you soon. Take care, everybody.